If you're looking to either buy a business or sell a business, you might be wondering, what should I sell the business for, or what should I pay for this business to make sure that I'm getting a fair and reasonable deal? This is going to talk about businesses under the $1 million mark. We do with a lot of businesses between the $2 and $35 million mark, but we get calls once in a while saying, I'm trying to figure this little pizza restaurant out, and I want to know exactly what I should pay for it or what I should sell it for. So there's two general numbers that people look at in terms of profitability. One is discretionary earnings, or that owner benefit, that money that one working owner is going to get out of the business if they work in the business, even if they're writing things off, adding those things back. The other one is called EBITDA, which is the generally used in larger businesses, and that's the money that you'd be getting out of the business if you were paying a manager to run the business and you were just going to collect the profit, maybe oversee it. The formula is quite simple. It's the profit of the income on the bottom line on the tax returns, adding back things like non-recurring expenses. Maybe in one case, the owner decides that they're going to remodel the business so it'll look good, and they spend $50,000, but they don't do that every single year. Non-recurring income would be subtracted from it. Several years back, a lot of businesses got a check from BP Oil because the coastal businesses were impacted due to the spill that they had. Non-operating expenses could include things like paying a spouse who doesn't work in the business, but you'd like to have that spouse get a check, or maybe writing off an expensive car. Non-operating income might be some rental property nearby that the owner is collecting during the day-to-day operation, but it's not going to pass on to the new person that's buying the business. There's also depreciation and amortization, which are just items for taxes mostly, and incentivizing people to keep investing in the businesses. Interest expense is personal to the business. A new person may or may not be getting a loan for the business. Nonetheless, that's added back so we can compare apples to apples. And then, of course, the total owner compensation. So for a smaller business, imagine the business did $375,000 in annual revenues at a pizza restaurant, and you could look at multiple years. I'm just going to look at 1 year to keep it simple out there. Cost of goods, $135,000. They're paying themselves $45,000. Salaries and wages is $75,000. You can see the other things like they paid rent, they paid interest, depreciation, amortization, all other expenses. Okay, this would include utilities, rent, etc. I'm keeping it really, really simple. But in this particular case, it looks like the business generated $25,000 if you looked on the tax returns. And you might say, well, how's that going to work? How's that going to look to the buyers? Or a buyer might look at it going, well, I thought the seller said they were making close to $100,000. So we go back and we say, oh, yeah, hold on. We've got to note that the seller or the owner of the business currently is paying themselves $45,000, so that gets added back because that's part of the income, and that they're adding back depreciation, amortization, interest expenses. Remember, I talked about the sports cars, those kind of odd things that aren't necessary. If the sports car is not tied to the business, but the owner is using that as an owner benefit or a perk somehow, that would get added back to say the new person doesn't have to own a sports car. So now, in case of instead of $25,000, you've got $100,000. But you might say, well, what do I do with that? So one thing you might go about doing is taking a look at what other businesses similar to this somewhat have sold for in the past. Here's a summary. I love peer comps, one of my favorite sources of data and information, but certainly not the only one. This is based on about $270,000 locations or businesses that were sold over time. And this is just going back about 5 years or so. Or I guess it goes back to 2006. So what's important about it is looking at the multiples averages. Don't get too concerned about what happened in the past. Things are cheaper, but the percentages tend to stay very consistent over decades of time, except maybe during the COVID time, etc. Nonetheless, we're going to keep it kind of simple here, and we're going to look at these numbers on this line. Remember, we talked about multiple sellers' discretionary earnings based on $270,000. And the business that we're looking at, I kept it simple, made $100,000. You'd say, well, on the low end, a similar business that was making $100,000 was sold for $100,004. In this case, on the high end, it sold for 5.51 times $100,000 is $551,000, but more like on the average, we're 2.72. And if you remember statistics class, you're looking at the median sometimes gives you a better insight because it's in the middle of a list of numbers. And if on one end or the other, there's these really crazy numbers that can throw off the average. In this case, they're pretty darn similar. EBITDA, there's a number for that too. You can look at the high and the low, and you can look at what it did on average. In this case, these are pretty close as well. They're both, 2 points away from 4 times earnings on that factor out there. So keep in mind the different multiples and the different factors. Do your research. Always hire an accountant, attorney, a professional business evaluation person, and somebody who really knows the industry and somebody that's good at doing the process support, a business intermediary or business broker. You check out the International Business Brokers Association, Florida Business Brokers Association. You can find a list of great people on there as well. Hopefully this will help you a little bit. Thank you. Good luck and take care.